As a child, I often marveled at how deeply one could sink into their own thoughts, as if diving into an endless void. I would spend hours lost in my imagination, wondering how the world might look if everything were wiped clean, if nothing remained but the sheer fact of existence. It was just a whimsical game back then, but as the years passed, I began to sense something shifting within me. Instead of clear memories, fragments would surface, disconnected and elusive, like pages torn from a book I couldn't piece back together. It wasn't just the memories themselves, it was the unsettling sensation that they were slipping through my grasp, replaced by an ever-expanding emptiness. Sometimes I questioned whether these gaps were my mind's way of shielding me, a protective mechanism against something too overwhelming to face. But the more I pondered, the more I felt that this emptiness wasn't a retreat. It was an invitation, a doorway to something far greater, though I lacked the courage to step through. The void was complete, an all-encompassing darkness. Oddly, I wasn't afraid, though some part of me thought I should be. Fear felt distant, as if unable to reach me, leaving behind a peculiar emptiness. Where was I? The sensation reminded me of being in a sensory deprivation chamber. Perhaps that's exactly where I was. I strained to remember how I'd arrived here, but my mind was a blank slate. The absence of memory sparked a faint flicker of unease, but it was fleeting, too far removed to take hold. The darkness itself was strange. I tried moving my eyes, but there was no change, no shadows, no outlines. I attempted to turn my head. Still, nothing. For all I knew, I could be spinning wildly, yet the static blackness offered no evidence of movement. An absurd image of my head whirling on a turntable flitted through my thoughts. At least it was something. Anything to think about. Time stretched endlessly. Perhaps I drifted into sleep, though I couldn't be certain. The unyielding darkness made such distinctions irrelevant. Frustration welled up as my attempts to summon memories yielded nothing. Who was I? Where was I? Resignation was infuriating, but giving up seemed inevitable. Maybe a new tactic was in order. If I couldn't remember who I was, could I focus on something more elemental, more foundational? I latched onto a simple, crystalline idea. I think, therefore I am. The thought brought comfort, but also an odd sense of detachment. The idea wasn't mine, though I couldn't explain how I knew this. Frustration simmered again, and I let it linger, futile as it seemed. Who was I? What was I? The questions spiraled, but I ignored them. Chasing answers had led nowhere, and frustration wasn't worth repeating. Instead, I shifted focus to the act of thought itself. How did I understand the words I was forming? Abstract meanings led to concrete concepts. What if I leaned into the tangible? A new clarity surfaced. I pictured a diagram from a biology textbook, something about the brain. Books. I loved books. Shelves upon shelves of them in a library waiting to be explored. That memory was oddly comforting, though it raised more questions. Why did I love books? Who had I been in that moment? The floodgates opened. Images and associations poured in, a red bus kissing someone on the back seat, her lips warm and soft. Her name eluded me, as did mine, but the memory glimmered vividly before fading like smoke. My mind buzzed with fragments. Was I dreaming? Oversleeping? The scattered pieces felt familiar yet intangible. My thoughts ricocheted unpredictably. Roads, cars, words, concrete and abstract blurred together. Euphemisms surfaced, purple prose and fragments of historical context. I mentally shrugged off the rabbit trails, then something shifted. The void, so uniformly black, revealed a tiny, flickering point of light. I stared, mesmerized. Fear lingered at the edge of awareness, but I couldn't look away. The light remained, steady and unchanging at first. Over time, it grew, a line, then a shape, until it resolved into a string of glowing pearls. Each bead shimmered with an otherworldly radiance, beautiful and hypnotic. The string expanded, filling my vision. Were the beads stationary, or was I moving toward them? A faint sensation of falling answered the question. My perception shifted. I was no longer motionless, but hurtling toward the luminous orbs. As I neared, the beads transformed into bubbles, and within each one, I glimpsed people. The sight ignited a yearning within me, a deep need for connection, for contact with another human being. The bubbles beckoned, promising answers, companionship, or perhaps simply an escape from the solitary abyss. By the time I thought to count the glowing beads or bubbles, I was too close to take them all in. My trajectory seemed fixed on one in the center. Before I could wonder why, I slid seamlessly through its surface. Suddenly, it was 1994. Lauren was crying again. No surprise there. She always cried when I was around. And when she cried, her mother always blamed me. This time, Lauren's arm was red and bruised where I'd gripped it too tightly. I released her, horrified by the marks. I hadn't meant to hurt her, but she sobbed inconsolably, seeming to relish the drama. "What have you done now, you dreadful boy?" Lauren's mother stormed toward me, her voice sharp with fury. She grabbed my ear and turned my head to make me face Lauren's bruised arm. "Look at that! What do you have to say for yourself?" I stayed silent. Explaining never helped. In her eyes, I was always the villain. But this time had been different. Lauren had wandered straight into the path of an oncoming car. I'd lunged to pull her back just in time, gripping her arm harder than I realized. For one breathless moment after the car passed, I hoped someone might understand. Instead, Lauren cried louder and her mother's rage descended like a storm. The slap came without warning, leaving my cheeks stinging and my pride shattered. I hit the ground, humiliated. "Stay away from my daughter," she spat, scooping Lauren into her arms. As they walked away, her scathing words cut deeper than the slap. "Don't worry, sweetheart. He won't hurt you again." I stayed on the ground, cheeks burning. My tears threatened to spill, but I bit them back. It wasn't fair. None of it was. Just then, a hand appeared in front of me. "Why didn't you say something?" Elizabeth asked as she helped me to my feet. "She wouldn't have believed me," I muttered. "She never does." Elizabeth was 14, 3 years older than me, but she treated me like the little brother she never had. "You didn't think this was the first time, did you?" she asked, folding her arms. "How many times have you saved Lauren from trouble?" I thought about it. 5, I said, counting today. 5? She repeated, astonished. "What happened?" I listed the incidents. When I was 7, I stopped her stroller from rolling into traffic. Then someone shoved a shopping cart her way and I caught it before it hit her. Next, she fell off a climbing frame. I broke my nose catching her, but she ran crying to her mom and I got blamed again. Last year, she got tangled in river weeds. I dived in and freed her, but by the time I got her out, she was hysterical and her mom assumed the worst. And now this. Elizabeth shook her head. "No wonder my dad always says, 'No good deed goes unpunished.'" Her hug was warm and unexpected, making my frustration melt away. I'd nursed a quiet crush on her for ages, and when she kissed my cheek softly, the sting of the slap faded entirely. Her knowing smile lingered as she stepped back, leaving me floating in a haze of gratitude. The darkness returned, pressing in around me like a suffocating shroud. My mind churned with questions, restless and unanswered. The scene I had just experienced lingered uneasily, vivid yet distant, as though I'd watched it through someone else's eyes. Lauren's presence gnawed at me. Something about her didn't sit right. And Elizabeth, though she felt like an older sister, couldn't be. I had no siblings. While it all felt crystal clear during the moment, now it was slipping into an intangible haze. I remembered my father, his death shrouded in muted pain. He had been a hero, saving a child from a runaway truck, but losing his life in the process. Was I the child he'd saved? The thought nagged at me, but the details wouldn't solidify. The sting of Lauren's mother's slap still echoed faintly in my mind, but before I could untangle these thoughts, I felt the pull again. The momentum drew me into the next bubble. It was 1995. I stood in a small, dimly lit store, the sunlight outside making the interior seem darker by contrast. A voice called out, and I turned to see a security guard walking toward me. Lauren and her friend stood just beyond the store windows, laughing and pointing in my direction. Their amusement at my predicament was painfully clear. Unease settled over me as the guard motioned for me to step aside. He asked if I had paid for everything in my bag. His tone was sharp, laced with suspicion, and I felt the eyes of nearby shoppers turn toward us. I insisted I had, but as his gaze narrowed, a creeping doubt formed. Could someone have slipped something into my bag without my knowledge? The idea seemed absurd, but the guard's scrutiny didn't waver. He led me toward a door labeled private, and an instinctive alarm flared within me. Something about being taken out of public view felt wrong. I stopped short, refusing to go further. A tense exchange followed, the guard growing visibly irritated, while I insisted on speaking with the manager in the open. The scene drew a growing crowd of onlookers, their whispers and murmurs adding to the tension. Eventually, the manager arrived, a man in his 30s with a poorly fitted suit and an expression of growing impatience. He wasted no time, demanding to see the contents of my bag. My grip tightened on it as I refused, recalling advice I'd once overheard. Never let them search your belongings unless they have the authority to do so. The manager's frustration boiled over. He lunged for the bag, but desperation lent me speed, and I pulled it out of his reach. The crowd, now larger, seemed to delight in the unfolding drama. Someone laughed, and the manager's face flushed red with anger. Yet, oddly, his escalating temper made it easier for me to remain calm. I pointed out that he wasn't a police officer and had no right to search me. The gathered spectators murmured in agreement, adding pressure to his mounting discomfort. Just as the tension reached its peak, the crowd parted, and two police officers, a man and a woman, walked toward us. Relief washed over me. Finally, an impartial authority. I wasted no time explaining. The guard had stopped me before I left the store, I said, and tried to take me to a private room. I refused, feeling unsafe, and insisted on staying in public. The manager had then tried to search me without cause. I carefully left out the guard's threatening demeanor, uncertain if mentioning it would help or hurt my case. The officers listened intently, their faces unreadable, before turning their attention to the guard. Under their scrutiny, he fidgeted uncomfortably and admitted to stopping me inside the store. The manager's frustration boiled over. He berated the guard harshly for not following proper procedure, his anger spilling into insults as they retreated through the private door. The sound of his shouting at the guard faded as the door swung shut. The officers turned back to me. With no evidence of wrongdoing, they let me go. The moment the tension broke, a wave of dizziness hit me. My surroundings seemed to lose their color, the edges of my vision graying. My legs wobbled, and I sank to the floor as nausea churned in my stomach. "Are you all right?" one of the officers asked, concern in their voice. I shook my head, bending forward and pressing my head between my knees. The room spun around me, the dizziness threatening to overwhelm. Their voices became faint, blending into the background, and the world around me dimmed. The last sound I heard before everything faded was someone calling my name. "James!" The rush of sound in my ears subsided as Elizabeth's voice cut through the haze. I felt her arms wrap around me, steadying me as the faintness receded. Despite the exhaustion, I reveled in the comfort of her embrace, unwilling to let go of the fleeting solace it brought. She assured the officers she'd see me home safely, her calm confidence persuading them to leave us without further questioning. As the officers departed, I glanced into my bag and discovered the prank Lauren and her friends had played, a piece of lingerie, likely intended to humiliate me if discovered. Annoyed but unwilling to give them the satisfaction, I tossed it toward a nearby rack. Elizabeth suggested a subtle revenge, talking loudly about kids caught pulling similar stunts on CCTV, letting them stew in fear. Her mischievous grin made the idea seem oddly appealing, but I felt too drained to fully engage. We walked out of the store together. Elizabeth mentioned her journal, an exercise she'd begun to prepare for a future career as a reporter. She enjoyed reflecting on past events to see if she could make mundane days sound interesting. Today, she assured me, was far from boring. Her laughter lifted the tension, though I remained lost in thought. The gaggle of girls outside scattered as we approached, but Lauren's gaze lingered on me. For once, she wasn't crying, though her stare carried a quiet weight I couldn't interpret. The blackness returned as we left, though it felt less absolute, more permeable, as if cracks were forming in its suffocating surface. I reflected on the scenes I'd experienced, trying to piece together the threads. Elizabeth and Lauren were constants, but everything else felt disconnected. If this was virtual reality, it was unlike anything I'd ever imagined. How could it capture emotions and thoughts so vividly? A disturbing realization loomed, one I tried to push away. This wasn't VR. The thought clung stubbornly, refusing to let go. Was I dead? It seemed ridiculous. What was death supposed to feel like anyway? As I drifted in this uncertainty, a new scene began to form. The year was 1996. From my hiding spot among the trees, I watched in horror as Lauren grabbed the half-empty bottle of brandy and took a long swig. She and two friends had been sneaking drinks for over an hour, pretending to be more intoxicated than they were. The other girls egged her on with jeers and dares, their voices loud and mocking. Lauren, however, wasn't faking. The brandy spilled down her chin as she drank, and her coordination was rapidly unraveling. I'd followed them after seeing them steal the bottle, hoping to intervene before things got out of hand. But now, with half the bottle consumed in one gulp, it was clear I had waited too long. Alarmed, I stepped out of the shadows. The other girls screamed in surprise and ran off, leaving Lauren swaying unsteadily. She mumbled something incoherent and dropped the bottle, glass shattering against the ground. Panicking, I grabbed her by the shoulders. I couldn't leave her alone, but waiting for an ambulance seemed impossible. She needed help now. I remembered something about inducing vomiting to prevent alcohol poisoning, and hesitated only briefly before forcing her forward and using my finger to trigger her gag reflex. She resisted weakly but soon vomited violently, expelling the alcohol along with her last meal. Predictably, I ended up covered in the mess, while Lauren remained relatively unscathed. I let out a mirthless laugh at my misfortune. No matter how hard I tried to help, things always seemed to turn against me. Before I could collect my thoughts, a voice cut through the clearing. My heart stopped momentarily, expecting Lauren's mother. Instead, Elizabeth emerged from the shadows. "What are you doing to her?" she demanded, suspicion tempered with concern. Unlike most people, Elizabeth didn't automatically assume I was in the wrong, though she wasn't naive about my capacity for mischief. Quickly, I explained the situation, emphasizing Lauren's reckless drinking and my attempt to stop the alcohol from harming her. Elizabeth assessed the scene with a calm practicality that steadied my nerves. She agreed to call an ambulance while I prepared to take Lauren home. Her sharp gaze softened as she looked at me. "You followed them to keep her safe, didn't you?" she asked. I shrugged, unsure of my motivations. Elizabeth sighed. "You should have told someone, but at least you were here when it mattered." She left to find help, and I steadied Lauren as we prepared to leave the clearing. The mess on my clothes, the exhaustion in my limbs, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on me, but there was no time to dwell. This time, at least, I'd done something right. Elizabeth darted off to find a phone, leaving me with a teary, unsteady Lauren. Her crying had begun in earnest, and I couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for her mother to turn up and unleash her wrath. That thought jolted me into action. I urged Lauren forward, guiding her through the trees until we emerged into the open field behind our houses. Relief washed over me when I saw no one around. Maybe, just this once, I'd escape blame. That hope was short-lived. A voice screeched from across the field, "Take your hands off my daughter!" Lauren was yanked from my grasp by another adult and ushered toward her home. Before I could react, her mother descended on me. With a shove, she sent me stumbling to the ground, her words laced with venom. "You're filthy drunk and covered in vomit. You're disgusting," she spat, as a small crowd of teenagers gathered to jeer. The situation spiraled out of control, and I braced myself for what would come next. Just then, an ambulance pulled up, its lights cutting through the tension. The paramedics arrived, their calm professionalism a stark contrast to the hostility around me. Ignoring Lauren's mother's tirade, one paramedic gently addressed me, coaxing me toward the ambulance. Desperate to escape the crowd, I nodded and followed, my exhaustion evident. Elizabeth appeared, breathless but determined, demanding to know what had happened. I recounted the events tersely, Lauren's reckless drinking, her mother's wrath, and the angry mob that almost turned on me before the medics intervened. Elizabeth, ever my defender, stepped in to clarify that I wasn't the drunken culprit. "He made her sick to save her," she said fiercely, glaring at anyone who dared doubt me. The paramedics, initially skeptical, softened as the story unfolded. "You probably saved her life," one of them admitted, though they added with gallows humor that next time I should stand behind the person before making them vomit. Their words offered a glimmer of reassurance, though I still wasn't certain I'd done everything right. After giving them Lauren's address, I watched them head off, bracing themselves for the inevitable clash with her mother. Elizabeth turned to me, wrinkling her nose at my state. "That makes 7?" she teased, referencing the number of times I'd gotten entangled in Lauren's disasters. I laughed weakly and asked if I could use her garden hose to clean up before heading home. By now, Lauren's mother had likely spread her version of events, and I doubted my own mother would take my side. Elizabeth chuckled and led me toward her house, calling me a hero as she did. Her humor lightened my mood, but as I scrubbed away the stench of the ordeal, a sense of inevitability lingered. No matter how often I tried to help, chaos always seemed to find me. The blackness enveloped me again, less oppressive now, as if the memories I was reliving were breaking through. I recognized a pattern. These weren't random visions, but key moments from my past, unfolding with a clarity I hadn't possessed at the time. Yet being an observer in my own life was far from satisfying. I longed to influence events, to do more than watch. As I drifted in the void, I pondered what it meant. Was this some kind of purgatory? A near-death experience? Or had I crossed into something final? Theories swirled in my mind, but the approaching shimmer of the next bubble distracted me. I was moving again, rushing toward another moment. It was 1997. The shouts and whistles of construction workers formed the backdrop to my walk to school, a daily symphony that seemed to amuse and annoy in equal measure. Most of the girls acted offended by the attention, though I'd noticed that those who were ignored one day often dressed more provocatively the next. It had become a game for me, spot the girl seeking validation. That day, it was Sarah, one of Lauren's friends, who'd gone all out with a mini skirt and crop top. The whistles grew louder as she passed the construction site, but it seemed to unsettle Lauren. She stopped to adjust her shoes, then discreetly rolled the waistband of her skirt to shorten the hemline further. As a shaft of sunlight illuminated her, I noticed a faint glow around her, subtle but distinct. A strange sense of foreboding settled over me, pulling me forward. Amid the noise of whistles and laughter, a worker's shout of warning cut through. I saw the danger before Lauren did, a scaffolding pole teetering, ready to fall. Without thinking, I sprinted the short distance between us and shoved her out of the way, just as the pole crashed onto the pavement where she'd been standing. The glow around her dissipated as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me to wonder what I'd just witnessed. The pole came down fast, and I froze in place, helpless to avoid its trajectory. It smashed into the pavement less than a foot from me with an ear-splitting crash, sending shards of stone flying. Some of the debris struck my face, leaving shallow cuts. The pole tipped sideways, slamming into my shoulder with a force that left it numb. Pain loomed on the edges of sensation, waiting to surface. Lauren, who had scraped her knees when I shoved her out of the way, had begun crying again. Her tears drew a crowd, friends, passers-by, and shocked adults, who gathered around her, fussing and fretting. It was clear that my proximity to an injured Lauren was a dangerous combination. Without waiting for someone to notice me, I eased along the wall, aiming to slip away unnoticed. Just as I rounded the corner, Elizabeth appeared beside me, her voice low and sardonic. "That's number 8, she murmured, referencing yet another time I'd gotten caught up in Lauren's misadventures. She slid her arm around me and steered me away from the scene, the growing noise of the crowd fading behind us. As we moved further from the chaos, snatches of conversation drifted to my ears, fragments of speculation, admiration, and confusion. "He pushed her out of the way," someone said. "Saved her life, I reckon." Another voice asked if I was all right, only to be met with puzzled responses about my absence. Then came the unmistakable tones of Lauren's mother, shrill and accusatory. "Who did this to you? Where is he?" she demanded, the words seething with misplaced anger. Sirens in the distance prompted Elizabeth to quicken our pace. She guided me toward the medical center, her support steady despite my growing pain. The ache in my shoulder worsened with each step, but Elizabeth's proximity was a comforting distraction. I was acutely aware of her scent, fresh and faintly musky, and the warmth of her presence. As my hand rested on her waist, it slipped slightly lower, drawn by the rhythm of her stride. She glanced at me with a teasing smile. "Not too injured to test your luck, huh?" she said, but didn't pull away. At the medical center, we were seen quickly. The streets quiet now that the school rush had passed. We concocted a simple story about me falling off a wall and cutting myself on broken glass. The nurse's skeptical glance suggested she didn't fully believe us, but she patched me up all the same. The bandaged shoulder throbbed, a dull reminder of how close I'd come to serious injury. Afterward, we left the center and walked slowly through the empty streets. I insisted Elizabeth leave me at the school gate. Trouble was inevitable, but dragging her into it would only make me feel worse. She hesitated, but eventually relented, leaving me to face the consequences alone. The front door of the school loomed ahead, forbidden to students my age, but sneaking in wasn't an option in my condition. I sighed and pushed it open, resigning myself to the fallout. Back in the dark void, the bubble of memory faded. These relived moments felt vivid, yet detached, like watching an old film where I was both actor and audience. As I drifted, thoughts flitted through my mind, fragmented and strange. Lauren had glowed, hadn't she? A shaft of sunlight had struck her just before the pole fell, creating an ethereal radiance I couldn't forget. It nagged at me, an enigma layered atop an already surreal experience. Questions swirled, fueled by a growing awareness of my predicament. Was this purgatory? A near-death experience? Or something else entirely? I remembered the stories I'd read, of lives flashing before one's eyes and vivid revisitations of the past. This felt different. Being a passive observer to my own memories was frustrating, but I was determined to find meaning in it. The shimmer of another bubble drew me forward, and I plunged into its depths. It was 1998. Raised voices reached my ears before I rounded the corner. A group of bullies had surrounded their latest target, their jeers and taunts unmistakable. A sharp cry of pain quickened my steps, and I sprinted toward the scene, my heart sinking when I saw Lauren at the center of their torment. The group surrounded her, shoving her between them. One person pulled at her hair, while another pushed her roughly. Lauren's face was streaked with tears, her arm held protectively against her side as if it were hurt. For once, I couldn't blame her for crying. I barreled into the circle without thinking, pulling her into my arms. The gang froze in surprise, their usual rhythm disrupted. Seizing the moment, I squared my shoulders and prepared to hold them off for as long as I could. "Get lost!" I shouted, hoping to buy enough time for someone else to intervene, or for Lauren to escape. The gang's leader, a tall, heavy-set girl with a reputation for toughness, stepped forward, sneering. "And what are you going to do about it?" she challenged. The odds were stacked against me, 7 or 8 to 1, but I stood my ground. I just hoped Lauren would have the sense to run when the moment came. She was stunned. This wasn't how these confrontations were supposed to go. Normally, threats would make the victim beg or flee, and someone would inevitably get hurt. It was a familiar script, safe, predictable. But this time, her gang was restless. Their previous victim had ended up in the hospital, and while everyone knew who was responsible, proving it was another matter. I stayed quiet, unwilling to give them a reason to act. "Let's take them both," sneered a gangly, acne-ridden boy, his suggestion greeted with murmurs of agreement. The tall girl leading the group hesitated, uncertainty flickering across her face. The tension in the air was palpable, and I braced for the worst. Before anything could happen, a voice shattered the standoff. "Leave her alone!" Lauren's mother stormed into view, yanking her daughter from my arms. Her scorn was sharp, directed at the gang and me alike. "9 of you against one little girl. Real heroes, aren't you?" she spat. Then, without warning, she slapped me hard across the face. "I warned you last time!" she hissed, before stalking away, dragging Lauren with her. Lauren tried to protest. "But Mom, he didn't!" But her words were cut short as the gang turned on me. The first blow knocked me off balance, sending me to the ground. From there, it was all kicks, relentless and brutal. I curled up, shielding my face as best I could, but some strikes still landed. Pain exploded with each connection, especially when a boot caught my ribs. Then suddenly, it stopped. "James!" Elizabeth's voice broke through the chaos. She and a group of her friends had arrived, scattering the gang. She knelt beside me, her face pale with worry. "What have they done to you?" Tears filled her eyes as she helped me sit up. I mumbled weakly, "Is Lauren okay?" Elizabeth turned to the onlookers and spoke loudly, her voice shaking. "The first thing he asks after all this is whether she's okay. Next time someone calls James a thug, remember this." The pain in my ribs surged as I tried to stand, and I gasped. "I think I need a hospital," I admitted. By now, a crowd had gathered, their whispers adding to my humiliation. "Serves him right," someone muttered. "About time he got what he deserved," said another. A passing policeman intervened, dispersing the crowd and calling for an ambulance. Elizabeth tried to explain what had happened, but as she hadn't seen the fight begin and I wasn't talking, there was little he could do. At the hospital, hours later, the same officer visited my bedside. He told me Lauren's mother had filed a formal complaint, accusing me of instigating the fight. "You don't have to say anything," he cautioned, but I was too exhausted to respond. When I woke again, my mother was sitting beside me. She smiled softly and asked, "Did you do what she says?" "No," I whispered. "Then that's all I need to know," she said, squeezing my hand. The officer returned later to tell me the charges had been dropped. "Not enough evidence," he explained, his tone lighter. "Someone took photos of you before you were treated. No jury would have bought her story with how battered you were. What did you do to make that woman hate you so much?" I shrugged, unwilling to answer. He left, and I slipped back into restless sleep, the darkness feeling like a reprieve. The school crowd roared as our local football team took the field. The game was an exhibition match, raising funds for the school and local charities. The energy was electric, with students cheering wildly as the pros toyed with our team, showcasing their skills. When the opposing striker launched the ball from over 25 yards out, it soared into the net, igniting a wave of excitement throughout the crowd. The cheers turned to screams as a section of temporary seating began to collapse. I turned just in time to see people tumbling forward. Among them, I spotted Lauren falling from the top row. Without thinking, I lunged and grabbed her arm, stopping her midair. The force of her fall wrenched my arm painfully, and I realized with growing horror that it was bent at an unnatural angle. As I pulled her up with my other arm, she cried out, clutching her shoulder. Her tear-filled eyes met mine. "James, your arm!" she gasped. Ignoring her, I scanned the chaos below, trying to help others climb to safety. Each movement sent waves of pain through my injured arm, but I kept going, pulling as many people as I could to safety. The screams and cries for help were endless, but my focus remained on those I could save. By the time rescue workers arrived, I was drenched in sweat, my arm throbbing relentlessly. Lauren, still crying, held on to me as the paramedics approached. Her injuries were minor, but she wouldn't leave my side. As I was helped onto a stretcher, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what I did, it wouldn't change Lauren's mother's opinion of me. But for once, it didn't matter. I'd done the right thing, even if it meant yet another scar to carry. Elizabeth and I helped organize a makeshift rescue line, pulling people from the wreckage. Even Lauren joined in, setting aside her tears to lend a hand. Occasionally, she glanced at me, confusion flickering in her eyes, and urged me to get my arm checked. I shrugged off her concern. There were still others trapped, and as long as I could stand, I was better off than the people beneath the debris. Relief came in the form of firefighters in fluorescent jackets who swiftly took over with ropes and ladders, their efficiency cutting through the chaos. One of them, a man in a white helmet, approached us. He praised my efforts but froze when he saw my arm. "That needs immediate attention," he said firmly, instructing Elizabeth to take me to triage. Elizabeth guided me through the crowd as the pain in my arm intensified to the point where speaking became impossible. Lauren followed briefly, clutching her shoulder, but the jostling crowd soon separated us. Elizabeth stayed close, shielding me from the worst of the chaos, and led me toward the flashing lights of an ambulance. A medic examined my arm gently but grimly. "Dislocated elbow, maybe a fractured forearm," he said. "No pain relief until the doctor sees you, I'm afraid." He draped an orange card around my neck and moved on to other patients. Elizabeth stayed by my side, filling out forms and reassuring me. I murmured for her to check on Lauren later, but before I could say more, exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke, the searing pain in my arm had dulled to a manageable ache. I was lying on a stretcher in the back of an ambulance, the muted wail of a siren and flashes of blue light filtering through the windows. Elizabeth was beside me, her expression brightening as I stirred. "What happened to my arm?" I asked groggily. "A doctor reduced the dislocation while you were unconscious," she said, grinning. "You'd have liked her. She was gorgeous." I laughed weakly, relieved by the absence of pain. Too bad I wasn't awake. Meeting her might have made all this worth it. Elizabeth rolled her eyes but smiled. "That's number 10, she teased. "You're always in the middle of these disasters." "Let's hope it's the last," I muttered. I leaned back, exhaustion overtaking me once more. After the hospital confirmed no fractures, I was sent home. Elizabeth had called my mother, who fussed over me during my recovery. News outlets ran exaggerated stories about a mystery hero saving lives at the collapse, but Elizabeth kept my identity a secret. She teased me about the absurd reports, and I teased her back, warning her not to write such nonsense when she became a journalist. The memory of that time shifted unexpectedly. Elizabeth had babysat for my mother one evening during my recovery, and we'd shared a passionate moment, an electrifying kiss, the silken feel of her skin under my hands. I remembered her laughter breaking the tension afterward, her teasing promise that it wouldn't happen again. I longed to relive that moment, but the bubbles seemed determined to show me only chaos and pain. The moon was full, casting a soft glow over the quiet streets. I'd left my friends early, choosing to walk home instead of taking the bus. As I rounded a corner, movement caught my eye. A figure was climbing out of Lauren's bedroom window and onto the garage roof below. I stopped, holding my breath, as Lauren dropped to the ground with surprising ease. In the moonlight, her overalls seemed at odds with her purpose. She pulled them off to reveal a dress so short it barely qualified as clothing, then slipped into a pair of high heels from her pocket. With a quick adjustment of her hair, she strode toward town, her phone pressed to her ear. "It's me, Jack," she said softly. "Yes, I'm on my way. I did what you asked. Just the dress and heels." Her breathy tone sent a chill through me. This wasn't going to end well. I stayed in the shadows, resigned to follow her. Jack, her newest boyfriend, was older and far less naive than the boys she usually manipulated. It was clear from her attire and the excitement in her voice that the power dynamic had shifted. Whatever awaited her that night, I couldn't shake the feeling it wouldn't be good. It was easy to follow her. At first, I darted between shadows, but I quickly realized that sneaking around only made me look suspicious to anyone watching. So I opted to walk casually, keeping a safe distance behind her. Lauren's destination was obvious, the park known for its dark, secluded corners. During the day, it was a haven for kids and dog walkers, but at night, it transformed into a magnet for risky encounters. I watched uneasily as she disappeared through a side gate, the main entrance long locked for the night. After a moment's hesitation, I followed. The moonlight illuminated the park's paths, and Lauren's confident stride was easy to track. While the park wasn't empty, most people there avoided eye contact, busy with their own clandestine meetings. I stayed close but tried to blend in, keeping to the grass. Suddenly she vanished. One moment she was ahead of me, and the next, she was gone. I retraced my steps and spotted faint footprints in the damp grass leading into the woods. My stomach twisted as I followed them. Inside the trees I heard voices, a low, menacing rumble and a higher-pitched, nervous tone. Jack and Lauren, I presumed. Moving closer, I strained to make out their words, and my unease turned to dread. "Jack, you're scaring me," Lauren said, her voice shaking. "And you love it," Jack replied, his tone mocking. "Dressed like that? You're asking for it." "Please, let me go. I don't want to do this." "Stop fighting. You know you want it." A slap cut off her protests, followed by a scream. I pushed through the undergrowth and found Lauren on the ground, her dress pulled up and a red mark blooming on her face. She looked ethereal in the moonlight, her beauty almost surreal, but the scene was anything but. Jack loomed over her, his expression dark and dangerous. "Leave her alone," I said, stepping forward. Jack turned, his eyes narrowing. "No," I glanced at Lauren. "Get up and go home, now." She scrambled to her feet, clutching her dress as she ran toward the park's entrance. Jack moved to follow, but I stepped in his path. For a moment he seemed unsure, and I dared to hope he'd back down. Then he roared in anger and charged. I turned to run, but he was faster than I'd expected. I tripped, and before I could get up, his boot connected with my shoulder, sending waves of pain through my body. I curled into a ball, trying to protect myself as he rained kicks on my arms, legs, and ribs. Each strike felt like a hammer blow, and I could hear my bones cracking. Just when I thought it wouldn't stop, I heard someone crashing through the trees. A heavy branch struck Jack's head, and he staggered. Another blow followed, then another. Dazed, he turned and fled. I looked up to see Elizabeth standing over me, a makeshift club in her hand. Relief flooded me, but the pain was too overwhelming to speak. Elizabeth dropped to her knees beside me, her voice trembling. "Oh, James, what did he do to you?" She tried to keep me awake as sirens approached, her words a lifeline against the encroaching darkness. Paramedics arrived, and their calm efficiency was the last thing I remembered before blacking out. I woke in a hospital bed, tubes snaking out of me in every direction. A doctor, brisk and professional, gave a quick summary of my injuries. A dislocated arm, fractured ribs, and internal bleeding that had been controlled without surgery. My mother sat beside me, her expression a mixture of relief and worry. "I'm sorry, Mom," I said weakly. "I didn't have a choice." "I know, James. Elizabeth told me everything. You were brave, but I wish you didn't have to get hurt." She explained that they'd kept the incident quiet to avoid involving Lauren and her mother. I agreed. There was no sense dragging Lauren into more trauma, or risking her mother twisting the story. Grateful for her understanding, I urged my mom to get some rest. Elizabeth took her place, sitting close and talking softly until fatigue overcame me again. As I drifted off, I felt a deep gratitude for her unwavering support, even as I dreaded the inevitable scars, physical and emotional, that this night would leave behind. Elizabeth urged me to sleep as my eyes drooped again, promising to see me tomorrow. Hours later, I woke to find the familiar fatherly policeman standing at the foot of my bed. He smiled warmly and settled into the chair beside me, his deliberate silence prompting me to speak first. "This is becoming a habit," I said, my voice hoarse. "A habit," he replied with mock seriousness. "Meeting like this, people will talk." I managed a grunt, too exhausted for banter. He continued, "Funny thing, I ask around about James Preston and hear stories about a thug or a tearaway. But when I check your record, all I find are unsubstantiated complaints. At school, they have nothing but good things to say about your work and behavior. And last year, I hear you saved lives despite a dislocated elbow, which I'm told is excruciatingly painful." I blinked rapidly, holding back unexpected tears. It was rare for anyone outside of Elizabeth or my mother to look at me without suspicion. The officer's tone softened. "You'll be pleased to know Jack Lawson won't trouble you again. Got himself stabbed in a bar fight. Once he's out of the hospital, he has a list of charges waiting. He'll be away for a long time." "Thanks," I murmured, grateful for the news. He flipped open his notebook. "Now, your statement." "What statement?" I asked warily. He smirked, reading in an exaggerated tone. James Preston stated it was too dark to see his assailant. Relief flooded me. Thank you. He stood, patting my shoulder. Let's not make this a tradition, all right? I nodded, watching him leave as he whistled a jaunty tune. Despite everything, I found myself liking him. As I lay back in bed, pain radiating through my body, I marveled at how my life had reached this point. If it wasn't Lauren's mother targeting me, I was getting injured in some misadventure. The escalation was clear, and I dreaded what the next bubble might bring. Ahead of me, the last bubble shimmered, its colors shifting hypnotically. There was no slowing my approach. Somewhere distant, a girl's voice whispered, soothing and familiar. The dread of reliving what seemed to be the moment of my death settled over me. But I had no choice. 2001. How's university? I asked. Elizabeth glanced at her watch. Same as 20 minutes ago when you last asked. Sorry, I'm just happy to see you, I said awkwardly. It's been so long since I've talked to someone who doesn't hate me. She smiled sympathetically. No let up then? Not much, I admitted. Lauren's mother seems quieter now, but it's always something. Elizabeth studied me, her concern evident. What are you going to do? Keep my head down. Avoid Lauren, I said, though unease rippled through me. I shivered involuntarily, brushing it off as nothing. Elizabeth laughed lightly, but soon checked her watch again. I've got to meet our moms. Big shopping trip planned. We left the food court and pushed through the crowded mall, her chatter about university filling the space between us. A commotion ahead caught my attention. A knot of people had gathered, shouts echoing from a building society. I moved toward the crowd, my unease deepening. Through the windows, I saw a robbery unfolding, desperate and chaotic. Then I saw her, Lauren and her friends, laughing and unaware, walked directly toward the danger. My stomach dropped as a robber burst through the door, wild-eyed and brandishing a tool. The spotlight from the mall's ceiling illuminated Lauren, her figure glowing like an omen. She froze, her eyes locked on the Colt as the robber screamed incoherently, his finger curled around the trigger. Without thinking, I surged forward, shoving Lauren to the side just as the tools discharged. The sharp crack of the sound was strangely muted, almost toy-like, but I felt a tap near my shoulder. Light, like someone brushing past. For a fleeting moment, I thought I'd been spared. Then my legs gave out and I collapsed. The noise around me returned in full force. Screams, shouts, chaos. I vaguely registered hands on my face and opened my eyes to see Lauren leaning over me, her face streaked with tears. James, she sobbed, her voice breaking. Oh God, what has he done to you? The pain hit me like a tidal wave after an eerie numbness, ripping through my back and forcing a scream from my throat. I vaguely heard Lauren shouting for no one to move me. Then slowly, the scene dissolved into blackness. When I emerged from the final bubble, the memory of the bullet was still sharp. I finally understood what was happening. There was no more to experience. This was the end. Oddly, I felt calm. Maybe it was the inevitability or maybe something inherent in the process. But I was grateful. Calm was better than panic. I reflected on my life. Despite everything, I'd made a difference. Lauren's life could have been drastically worse without my interventions. Dead, disfigured, or with a ruined future. That was worth something. But still, I couldn't help thinking it would have been nice to relive one of life's better moments instead of all this pain. The blackness around me softened, tinged with gray and pink. Then a shaft of light pierced through, and a voice called my name. Bracing myself, I moved toward the light. James, wake up! A voice urged. I opened my eyes, blinded by a sharp light. He's awake! A familiar voice exclaimed. I blinked, my vision clearing to reveal Elizabeth and my mother standing over me, both with tears streaming down their faces. I tried to speak but could only croak. Someone offered me water, and with a few small sips, my throat began to work again. Mom? Elizabeth? What happened? My voice was weak, but I managed to ask. Before they could answer, another voice interjected. We'd prefer if you remembered on your own. What's the last thing you recall? After a struggle to piece together my fragmented memory, I rasped. I was pushing Lauren away from an attacker. There was screaming, then a punch in the back, and blackness. The doctor nodded. You were injured by a bullet. It lodged in your shoulder blade, preventing it from reaching your lung, though it caused significant damage. We managed to repair most of it, and you've healed well. However, you've been in a coma for nearly a year. These two ladies never gave up on you. Elizabeth chimed in, her voice fierce. You're a hero, James. I shook my head, irritated. Is Lauren okay? She's fine, Elizabeth reassured me. She probably saved your life by keeping everyone from moving you until the paramedics arrived. I grunted. Even Mrs. Brown can't blame me for this one. A soft gasp from across the room drew my attention. Lauren's mother stood there, and despite my irritation, I muttered an insincere, "Sorry." Before she could respond, the doctor ushered everyone out, insisting I needed rest. 2 weeks later, I was sitting up on my own, free of the tubes and drips that had tethered me to the hospital bed. Elizabeth entered, looking nervous. She held a newspaper in her hand. "Is everything okay?" I asked, noting her expression. She hesitated, then said, "I wrote an article about you. I had to. You were in a coma, and I thought people needed to know the truth." "What kind of article?" I asked warily. She handed me the folded paper. The headline read, "Guardian Angel in Our Midst" by Elizabeth Carter. The article chronicled every time I'd saved Lauren, from stopping her runaway pushchair at 7 to taking a bullet for her at 18. Each incident was detailed, including how her mother had misjudged me time and again. It was written with clarity and passion, setting the record straight. When I finished reading, I looked up at Elizabeth. "You wrote this?" She nodded. "I wanted everyone to know what you've done. You deserve that." "Thanks," I said softly, overwhelmed. As I lay back that night, I reflected on the article. For the first time, the weight of all those years felt lighter. I'd done what I could. Maybe now, finally, I could let it all go. In 1995, Lauren and her friends thought it would be funny to slip lingerie into James's shopping bag while he browsed a bookstore. When a store guard stopped him, James quickly realized the setup and managed to avoid being accused of theft. CCTV footage showed the girls' prank, sparing James but leaving them at risk of trouble with the law. The next year, James stumbled upon Lauren and her friends drinking in the woods. Lauren had downed half a bottle of brandy and was dangerously close to alcohol poisoning. Acting quickly, James forced her to vomit, saving her life but covering himself in the mess. As he tried to get her home, I arrived, and he asked me to call an ambulance. Unfortunately, Lauren's friends had alerted her mother, who accused James of being drunk and attacking her daughter. The arriving paramedics barely prevented the angry crowd from taking action against him. In 1997, James saved Lauren yet again. A scaffolding pole was about to fall on her, and he shoved her out of harm's way, taking the brunt of the impact himself. His shoulder was severely bruised, and his face was cut by shards of paving stone. Uninterested in explaining himself, he was already leaving the scene when I caught up and insisted he go to the hospital. By 1998, Lauren became a target for bullies. James intervened when a gang attacked her, protecting her from further harm, but the gang turned on him instead. Despite the beating he received, Mrs. Brown accused him of being part of the group that hurt her daughter. In 1999, a temporary stadium seating collapse nearly crushed Lauren. James caught her mid-fall, dislocating his elbow in the process. Even in immense pain, he pulled others to safety. Newspapers praised an anonymous hero, but James, enduring weeks with his arm in a sling, felt relief only because Mrs. Brown hadn't blamed him this time. The following year, James saw Lauren sneaking out to meet an older boyfriend. Sensing danger, he followed her to the park, where the boy tried to attack her. James intervened, saving her but suffering a severe beating in the process. My boyfriend and I found him barely conscious, and we managed to chase the attacker off. Despite his injuries, James's reputation as a troublemaker left him with no sympathy from anyone except a small few. In 2001, James, now 18, took a bullet meant for Lauren during a botched robbery. While Lauren escaped unharmed, James fell into a coma. His reputation once again led to whispers questioning his actions, but Elizabeth decided enough was enough. She wrote an article documenting every incident where James had risked himself to save Lauren. "Jesus, Elizabeth," I muttered, setting down the newspaper she'd handed me. "What were you thinking writing this? How am I ever going to face people now?" "Proudly," came my mother's voice. She stood in the doorway, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I can't tell you how proud I am of you, James." I sighed, shaking my head. It didn't matter what I did. It always backfired. Eventually, I gave up. It hurt that even you were disappointed in me. The only thing that kept me going was knowing Elizabeth believed in me. But once she left for college, I trailed off. My mother pulled me into a fierce hug. "I'm so proud of you. I could burst," she said, her tears wetting my cheek. I turned to Elizabeth, trying to lighten the mood. "How'd you convince your editor to publish it?" She grinned. "Quiet news day. I'd already written it, so I pitched it as a human interest story. Not my best work, but it's my first byline, and I'm proud it was about you." I woke later to find Elizabeth and Lauren sitting nearby, speaking quietly. Something felt off. Lauren seemed surrounded by an otherworldly glow, triggering a distant memory. "Lauren, are you okay?" I asked, startling both women. Lauren's face crumpled and tears streamed down her cheeks. Elizabeth's expression turned serious. "What do you mean? How do you know something's wrong?" I explained haltingly. "Every time I helped Lauren in the past, she'd have this glow around her before something happened. She has it now, but I don't know what to do. I'm in no shape to help." Elizabeth nodded, understanding. "This time, I think it's emotional, not physical. You can help her just fine." She turned to Lauren. "You need to tell him everything." Lauren hesitated, trembling. "I don't know how." "You owe him that much," Elizabeth said firmly before leaving us alone. Lauren sat beside me, wringing her hands. "I don't even know where to start. This is such a mess." "Start from the beginning," I suggested gently. "Pretend you're talking to a stranger." She took a deep breath. "Since I was a kid, I've felt like someone was watching over me. Not in a creepy way, comforting. I used to tell my mom I had a guardian angel, but she hated you, and it wasn't even your fault. I think it was because of my dad." Her voice faltered, but she continued. "I knew you saved me so many times, but she never believed me. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain. I'm sorry for that." She gripped my hand tightly, her words spilling out. "When you saved me from being hit, I thought it was so public no one could deny it. But even then, my mom twisted it. Then Elizabeth wrote that article, and it hit me. Everything you've done for me, all the times you saved me. I realized I'd never thanked you." Her words cracked something open inside me. I held her hand tightly, feeling an unexpected sense of peace. "You're welcome," I said softly, knowing those two words meant more than either of us could explain. Lauren's tears flowed freely as she recounted her confrontation with her mother. Armed with Elizabeth's article, she had finally forced Mrs. Brown to acknowledge the truth about my actions. At first, her mother denied everything, but Lauren refused to back down. She realized Mrs. Brown wasn't ready to face the idea of being wrong for over a decade. As Lauren spoke, I couldn't help but notice the perfection of her face, her tear-streaked cheeks, and her lips as they formed each word. My mind wandered. What would it be like to kiss her? It wasn't until she stopped speaking that I realized I had been caught in my daydream. "Sorry, I wasn't paying attention," I admitted, my face flushing with embarrassment. "What were you thinking about?" she asked, her tone playful but curious. "You," I stammered, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks. "What about me?" Her grin was both shy and teasing. "I was wondering what it'd be like to kiss you." She blushed deeply, but to my astonishment, she leaned in and kissed me. It was soft, sweet, and all-consuming. When we finally pulled apart, we both whispered, "Wow," before bursting into laughter. Her smile lingered. "Well, now you don't have to wonder." I blushed again, mumbling an apology for my distraction. But she kissed me once more and continued her story. Lauren described how she'd gone to my house after confronting her mother, guilt weighing heavily on her. My mother had been holding the article, tears streaming down her face. Lauren had babbled apologies and wished aloud that she could have taken the bullet meant for me. My mother's response was fierce. "James didn't spend 11 years keeping you alive so some maniac could shoot you." Lauren's voice cracked as she recounted how Mrs. Brown arrived mid-conversation, overhearing the truth for the first time. To everyone's shock, her mother apologized, to my mom and to Lauren. Tears welled in Lauren's eyes as she looked at me. "I've dreamed of moments like this, being here with you." I took her hand, brushing her tears away with a kiss. She confessed how she, her mother, and Elizabeth had taken turns sitting vigil at my bedside during my coma, reading to me, talking to me, and playing my favorite music. It was during those months that she realized she'd been hiding her feelings from me. "It's all so awful," she sobbed. "How can you even stand to look at me? My mother turned you into a pariah while all you ever did was save my life." I gently squeezed her hand. "Would it help if I told you that I love you?" The words surprised me as much as her, but I knew they were true. Before I could say more, she threw her arms around me, crying harder. "How can you love me after everything my mother did to you?" she asked between sobs. I thought for a moment before answering. Most of the time, I didn't think. When someone's in danger, you just act. It didn't matter what your mom thought, I knew the truth. And when Elizabeth noticed what was happening, I finally had someone who understood. I paused, my voice softening. "As we grew older, I realized I was always aware of you. I'd get this feeling when you were nearby, and when something went wrong, I was always there to help. Now I know why. I've loved you all along. She stayed in my arms, her warmth grounding me. The peaceful moment was interrupted by a throat clearing. We turned to see Elizabeth smirking at us. It's about time, she said, clearly amused. You two make a lovely couple. Lauren groaned. What will Mom say? Her mother's voice answered from the doorway, catching us both off guard. I'll say it's about time at least one of us got it right. We stared at her dumbfounded. She smiled, her face soft with emotion. Without you, James, I wouldn't have a daughter. I owe you everything. Mrs. Brown's facade crumbled and she sobbed quietly. I reached out, pulling her into a hug. You don't owe me anything, but I will happily take Lauren. She stiffened slightly before relaxing. As long as you'll have me for a son, I added with a grin. You're supposed to ask me first, James, Lauren teased, her voice light despite the tears. But if you must know, the answer is yes. Elizabeth's laughter filled the room. It wouldn't do for our little angel to be without her guardian angel, now would it? A beam of sunlight broke through the window, catching Lauren's hair and giving her an ethereal glow. I leaned back into my pillows, content to simply watch her. My angel, my heart, and finally, my love.